father should say something. That having been said, late last week, I went out to Hobby Lobby. I had a framing project. I have a little remembrance of my friend Michael, and when I get them, I frame them, and so I was on my way to frame them, and that's always kind of a thing, you know, when I'm doing that for him. And as I was going into the store and kind of mindful of carrying a poster around this in tissue paper to keep it from getting dirty, that's going to go back to the framing department. If you've been in Hobby Lobby, it's like a Kroger. There's all these people that are in there. And so I just noticed this woman, and then when I looked at her more carefully, my goodness, it looked exactly like my mother. I wouldn't say it was a spitting image, but the resemblance caught my attention. So I kept looking. And then I moved about, because I told myself that's really not my mother. She was a little bit shorter than my mother would have been, and it wasn't a complete dead spot-on match, but there's so much facial resemblance that when I would see her again, I would look. It occurred to me the third time I did this that the store manager will come the next time. Why are you bothering this woman? You know, so, and then she disappeared. I didn't see her again. You know, it reminded me as I thought about it, when I was in seminary. We went to Rome for an art and architecture class, and we stayed at the seminary in Rome. And so one of the seminarians, not of our group, but the students that were there, I noticed he bore a striking resemblance to Michael. Facial, the way he smiled, and he had black hair, Michael had brown hair, and Michael was much taller. But there was the face once again. You know, it's the first thing we look at is the face. And the way that he smiled, the way his forehead crinkled was, I mean, as spot on. I was really quite rattled by it. You know, I wondered about it, the whole thing. And the week we were there, if I would see him, it would happen again. I was just so certain that he looked like him, but also certain that he was not him. And so those events happening, particularly the one in the store this week, made me rethink how I was going to open tonight's homily. It's that idea that we catch glimpses of something that is deeper than what we're able to apprehend when we see it. When I saw the lady in the store, I just instantly thought about a beautiful song I love from Trisha Yearwood. She's a country music artist, and this was in 1995. And I've always loved this song, and it's kind of about, in a more poetic way, when I'm describing to you, glimpsing someone that you think is someone else. It goes this way. On a bus to St. Cloud, Minnesota, I thought I saw you there, with the snow falling down, around like a silent prayer. And it's strange, but it's true. I was sure it was you, just a face in the crowd, on a bus to St. Cloud. First time I confronted death in my life, I was 7 years old. This was 1962. We lived in Louisville, and my grandmother on my mother's side had passed away, Grandmother Blue. And so they lived just off Preston Highway, not very far from here, our Mother of Sorrows parish, and actually in Milford Lane. And at the corner of Milford and Preston is the Emery Bossy Funeral Home, which is still there. When we visited my grandparents, it was my older brother and I. The other three hadn't come along yet for the ride, but they did in due time. But when we would go visit grandmother and grandfather, we would drive by the funeral home, and young boys being what they are, we were curious about it. We had a sort of fascination about it. We knew that dead people were in there, and you wondered about that. There were fears. There were all sorts of things that kind of come with that. But, you know, it was a place we thought we'd haunted, had ghosts. You know, I mean, it's hard for me to engage my inner 7-year-old person, but at least at that time, that was a fascination and a fear all put together. When grandmother died, she was laid out in the Emery Bossy Funeral Home. So for the first time, I went in with my parents and my older brother. And when we went in, the first thing I noticed when we got to the parlor, you know, the funeral home is not just one room, it's parlors. And the parlors were filled with grown-ups. You know, when you're 7 and you see that many people that are so much taller than you, you know the two things are going to be true. One, no one is going to see you, so they'll be moving around with all of that. It's almost like you're not there. And then secondly, and this probably was more prominent in my mind, that many grown-ups will be talking the entire time, and their conversation will be utterly, totally banal and uninteresting. That's what really struck me when I saw that. Then I remembered the array of flowers. I'd never seen that many of them. Now, this is 1962, so it was considered proper back then for everyone to send flowers. So you never went to a funeral home and see a gazillion of these different things. We're a little bit more modest with that nowadays. But nevertheless, the room was filled with the smell of all. I don't think I'd ever smelled flowers like that before. Mother took each of us, my older brother and myself, up to the casket to see grandmother. So when I went up with her, it's the first time I'd ever seen a deceased person. And as I looked at her, and mother looked at her, and this is her mother, of course, she's an only child. This definitely was a traumatic event for her, and she's got her children and trying to help. She turned to me and she said, "Gary, Grandmother Ballou is sleeping." Now, you all know me, which means you won't be surprised to learn that at the age of 7, I was precocious. Because I'm still precocious at the age of 65, almost 66. But my 7-year precociousness could not help but comment back, "She doesn't look like she's sleeping to me." And you know, in my 7-year-old brain, I knew what it looked like when my grandmother slept, and this did not look like that. I'm not suggesting for a minute that I understood she was dead. I'm fairly certain I did not. And that I had any other type of real visceral reaction that came to that. In fact, that sort of went back into the mist of time after it happened. And it was when I was in seminary and taking a class in pastoral care where you try to learn about the approach of dealing with the dying and then dealing with grieving families and all of those sorts of issues. One of our projects was you had to think of the first death that had happened in your life and try to remember as much as you could about it. And when that project came to me, I recovered that memory of my grandmother, the flowers. Every time I tell the story, I tell it almost exactly the same way. It's how I remember it. And so, but I think the key thing there was I didn't understand, but I learned in that class that what my mother was doing when she said, "Gary, Grandmother Ballou is sleeping," she was attempting to soften the blow of death. Wasted effort since I was 7 to understand it in the first place, but she was grieving, and it was a major blow to her, which I always knew that it was, but that she was trying to soften that even for herself. But you see, when we say our loved ones are resting or sleeping, and when I say that, I speak of our deceased loved ones. Our living ones do sleep in the way that I'm describing, but the deceased, when they sleep, that word is also it's a euphemism. The church uses it in its ritual language as well. When we celebrate a funeral here, we always begin with a chant from the back of the church as we move forward into the church with the casket or the urn, as the case may be. And it's that Requiem, beautifully sung in Latin. It's basically rest in eternal peace. Many of you, like me, have heard that phrase all of our lives. But the idea of what kind of rest is that? Or if it's a sleep, what kind of sleep is that? You see, if when we die we take a really long nap, that just makes us Rip Van Winkle. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't sound very interesting to simply lay there and lay there and lay there. Those of us with attention deficit disorder have a terrible problem with the whole thing of just being inert all that period of time. So that the resting and the sleeping must be a euphemism as opposed to a scientific description. And indeed it is. When you search the church's prayers, the language it uses in its liturgy, particularly funeral liturgy, is concrete and on purpose. It's really to demonstrate what the church believes about what happens when someone that we love dies. And what the rest in eternal peace, is not a rest from a busy day. It's not a rest from exhaustion. It's not a part of one's normal sleep cycle. It's a rest you and I cannot imagine. It's a rest from anxiety. And this is why it's hard for us to imagine, is that you and I have lived around anxiety our entire lives. The only time when you're young enough you don't notice it, then you're like the family pet. You're aware something's not right in the room, although you can't put your finger on it. But soon enough, you learn how to be anxious yourself. Anxiety, fear of the future. Anxiety, fear of things we don't understand. And anxiety piled upon anxiety creates all kinds of trouble for every one of us. And so this resting that happens is a resting from anxiety. When we die, we are no longer anxious. We no longer suffer. And we are no longer susceptible to the temptation of the devil. The loss of a loved one, the death of a loved one, asks us, if we're Christians, to weigh two things that seem on their face contradictory: joy and sorrow. I first want to talk about joy. Joy, which we will profess in the creed in just a few moments, and the link between the death of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection. The two cannot be separated. In other words, you don't have a cross without the resurrection, and you most certainly don't have a resurrection without the cross. The resurrection makes it clear that Jesus died on the cross, but death could not conquer him, and he continued to live, living in a different and unique way. And you see, it's that truth that's articulated in all of the church's prayers, which becomes something for the people that we love, that they're not asleep, that they're not in some place they don't recognize, that they are instead experiencing resurrection. This is all, for us, impossible. We can't imagine it. We have no description of it. Whatever thought we have about it is more than likely not correct. You know, so I'm not going to waste your time with any vision I have of heaven or something, because I can't be certain of any of its accuracy whatsoever. But what the church definitively teaches is that those who have passed and are resting in peace rest joyfully. And you see, what we can have when someone dies is some measure of gratitude that now someone that we love is safely home. You see, as we say in the cemetery prayers, our true home is in heaven, and from it we await our Savior, Jesus Christ. That true home is the destination for every one of us, and we're still pilgrims journeying on the way. Death, while sad and sometimes very difficult for us, death also is the door that we make towards eternal life. I really like something that Ronald Rolheiser wrote. You know, we use him a lot in our bulletins. He's a really great spiritual writer, really understands the human condition. But something I read recently really jumped out at me as fitting this theme about joy. As Christians, he said, we believe that the dead are still alive themselves, and very importantly, still in a living, conscious, and loving relationship with us and with each other. After death, we live on in communication with others who've died before us, and in communion with the divine itself, and in communion with those we've left behind on earth. That's the Christian doctrine of the communion of saints. All too often we mistake communication for communion. They're different things. Indeed, when someone dies, we may no longer communicate with them in any of the conventional ways. And that is something that we instantly notice. Almost everyone has that in their death grief. You know, I will never hear my mother's voice again, or I'll never see Michael's face again, or all the little different things that we will say. They're all communicative types of things. The communication is really essential to our navigating around in the world. We all kind of know that. Communion is a different thing. Communion is this ability to now be with each other without anxiety in a place of harmony. It's just not possible in the life we're living in. So when someone dies, we can no longer communicate, at least not in the one-on-one sense. We can journal, which I think is a really good thing to do, or imagine, another good thing to do. I like to talk at the cemetery. Why not? Other people do that as well. In fact, I recommend it. I think it's a really good thing to do. But it's still, at least to us, a one-way kind of communication. And we can tell ourselves, because I cannot communicate with this person I love and I miss, something is lost in my life. And Ronald Rolheiser tells us that nothing is really lost. He says that we are fully alive, conscious and aware of the people that we've left behind. I've often said at funerals, we feel left behind and separated from the people who've died. They feel no such thing. They are not left behind and they're not separated. What an amazing thought that is. How can we feel what they feel? The answer to that's going to be communion when I get there. I mentioned there were two conflicting emotions, joy. We must talk about the emotion of sadness as well, because it's quite real. And the thing about joy and sadness, they're opposites, I suppose, if you want to use it in a theological sense. I believe that they are. But I'm talking about the experiences of joy and experiences of sadness. Experientially, joy is short-lived. You can only tolerate so much of it. I mean, joy, like I remember as a kid, presents, and at some point you were tired of opening up presents. You could not keep that sort of giddy, joyful state that it was Christmas. It was just too exhausting. It was much easier to bicker, fight, get irritated than it ever was to sustain some sense of joy. The monks of St. Myra do that because one year at Easter they told us we need to practice the discipline, as he called it, of joy. And I leaned over to my friend and said, well, that sucked all the fun out of Easter, didn't it? You know, so there's that whole idea then of the joy. Short-lived. It just doesn't seem to last long, and it becomes unbearable if it does. Sorrow is so very different. I think we all know that. Sorrow seems to never leave. Sorrow is like the uninvited guest that you can't get out of your house or whatever. Sorrow follows you. You say, I'm going to go to this other place, there won't be sorrow, but then sorrow follows you. And you don't expect it. It's going to happen. This is what happens when we grieve, and we're experiencing some sense of sorrow. And that is our journey. And so when we are experiencing that sorrow, even though it's very profound, elongated, on a time scale seems to be much more measurable time spent being sorrowful than the time we spent being joyful. We really are moving between two things. It isn't like we have a little of one and a lot of the other. It's actually both of them that work together. How can joy and sorrow work together? Well, it's a communion. That's what it is. That's how it works together. A communion is the joining of things, just like the joining of the bread and the wine, the body and blood of Jesus Christ. The communion we have today, we will join ourselves to the body of Christ in the ritual act of communion. And when we do that, something is happening that is the reason that you're here. And what is happening is that the rites of the church, and this is the sacrament of the Eucharist that we're celebrating, make the Lord present to us. We mistakenly get the idea that he's only present in the instant that the priest consecrates it. Where he goes, I don't know. And then he returns when you receive your communion host, and then you can go to the parking lot. That's a mistaken sense that we have about all of that. Actually, the Lord's presence, and his presence is not conjured up by us. His presence is made known to us. He's made known to us from the first note of music at the beginning of the liturgy to the last words of the music and the blessing at the very end of it. And over that range, we are having an experience of the communion of saints, the communion of heaven and earth. The very thing that we're looking for is at least presented to us in the Eucharist so that we can know Christ is there. And I'm going to say something a little bit more profound about that, which is that for Eucharist to be experienceable, it has to be something that's in our memory. Jesus understood memory, and so he told his apostles at the Last Supper, when he instituted the Eucharist, take this all of you and eat of it, take this all of you and drink of it, and at the end of that he said, do this in memory of me. When you and I remember, we're not just simply recovering a past event. We've made it present. I brought the memory of my grandmother's death to my mind and made it present. Maybe it didn't happen the way I did, but that's become the presence that is there that's very real when I do my recall of that. All remembering is making something present. So the very thing that makes us grieve, remembering the people we've loved and lost and we miss them terribly, when we're remembering them, they're as close to us as can possibly be. Not in communication, which is actually inferior to the greater thing, communion. That's why we call it the communion of saints. Because no emotional homily about death and dying is complete without a reference from the Shawshank Redemption, my very favorite movie because of the theological themes in it, which I think are very obvious. There's a little scene that I remembered as I was putting the homily together, where after Andy had broken out of Shawshank prison and Red was still in prison, so they were separated, and Red was reflecting on that separation. I love these words. Sometimes it makes me sad, though, Andy being gone. I have to remind myself that some birds aren't meant to be caged. Their feathers are just too bright. And when they fly away, the part of you that knows it was a sin to lock them up does rejoice. But still the place you live in is that much more gray and empty that they're gone. I guess I just miss my friend. That missing is the pain that is accompanied with grief. And the missing is part of this life. If heaven's what it's promised to be, we're clearly missing that, even though we do have glimpses of them. You see, the glimpses of heaven are not meant to just give us a teaser. They're not meant to be a preview of coming attractions. The glimpses are signs that are given to us. And glimpses, by the way, is not just simply visual. You know, Barbara up there also glimpses heaven, but does it maybe differently than some of us do. So we don't want to constrain the glimpse to what we see, but in all of our senses that we're taking in the world. Frequently, particularly in ritual and in sacrament and in prayer, the glimpses are right there for everyone to see. It's that evidence of the communion of saints. And those glimpses should give us some sense of hope that when this life comes to an end, we will be reunited with the people we missed the most. And when we're reunited with them, we will communicate with them the totality of their person. The person does not disappear when they're buried in the grave. The person doesn't disappear when they, quote, become a saint, someone better. That would not be the person that we miss. Instead, the person that we miss will be perfected, and we will be perfected too, which is communion. And so every time we glimpse that in the sacrament, we get something to sustain us. That's what it was. Communion was food for the journey, and you and I are still journeying, but we're journeying to a kingdom that awaits us. A kingdom that will eliminate our anxiety, suffering, and fear, not to mention grief. And you won't leave anyone you love behind. You're tempted to say it from the hospital bed, but you won't leave anyone behind, because you will still always be present in communion with them. I love a song that Roseanne Cash sang a couple of years ago about dying. She said, "All those years to prove how much I care. I didn't know it, but you were always there. Until September, when you slipped away, in the middle of my life on the longest day. Now I hear you say, I'll be watching you from above, because long after life, there is love." That pang of grief that we experience, that sorrow, that sadness, the tear that comes to our eyes, it can be thought of as a negative feeling, but I'm going to encourage you, as my therapist encouraged me, to journey deeper into that. It's a sign of connection. It's a glimpse, if you will. Now, we want to see the face. We want to see the person. That's the longing for heaven. But you see, in that glimpse, we can be assured that the people whom we miss still love us in the same way we still love them. Love is at the epicenter of all communion, and it's why it's the most joyful of all news in every liturgy that the Church celebrates. Those glimpses, then, will sustain us as pilgrims until we fully apprehend what awaits us at the end of the road. Towards the end of the song, On a Bus to St. Cloud, it goes this way. "And you chase me like a shadow, and you haunt me like a ghost. And I need you some, and I love you some, but I miss you the most. On a bus in St. Cloud, Minnesota, I thought, with the snow falling down around like a silent prayer."